Welcome to today's lecture on Late Middle High German. Shortly after 1300, it is possible to discern new tendencies in vernacular sources whose number is still quite small at the time. To be able to better classify these new tendencies, I will first offer a few notes on the sociolinguistical context. In the second half of the 13th century, there was a massive increase in German literature, both quantitatively, the number of German charters increased 20-fold from the third to the fourth quarter of the century, but also qualitatively insofar as the vernacular increasingly penetrated domains of knowledge where the written transmission had hitherto been in Latin. The domains of law and administration were particularly affected by this development. It is therefore understandable that at the turn of the 13th and 14th centuries, it became increasingly necessary to renegotiate the functional distribution of Latin and the vernacular. In such contexts, it is legitimate to point out the deficits of Latin for the first time. Ottokar aus der Gaal reports in his Styrian-rhymed chronicle, circa 1300 to 1318, that Rudolf von Habsburg, who is testified as being a promoter of German charters, opposed a Latin statement made by Bishop Bernhard von Seckau, arguing that an imperial matter should be discussed in German. Latin, Ottokar continues, is now functionally so limited that it belongs, quote, in the presbyteries of Mainz or Trier, i.e. the spiritual sphere. Der viel wohlgeborn von Rom, der König Rudolf, sprach zu dem Bischof: Habt ihr ich zu schaffen mit der keinem Pfaffen, da Latine zugehore, das baret uf die Chore zu Mainze oder zu Trier. Habet aber ihr gegen mir oder gegen dem Rieche ich zu suchen, des mag ich us den Buchen mit Worten nicht gefolgen. Mir wären darum erbeugen die Herren alle, die ihr hier seht. The formulation us den Buchen is striking here. On the one hand, it makes it clear that writing around 1300 was still strongly associated with Latin. However, it also reflects certain particularities about communication, the problems of which may also stem from an oral presentation conceived in writing. Barely a generation later, value judgments about the functional limitations of Latin in certain domains of use shifted. In the Liber Certarum Historiarum, written around 1340, Johannes von Victring tells us about a decision made by Rudolf von Habsburg regarding the issuance of royal charters. Decretum in his curis fuit ut privilegia vulgarita conscribantur, quia latinitatis difficultas errores et dubia maxima pariebat e laicus decipiebat. Statuit etiam, quod proper communem intelligentiam obscure latinitatis privilegia et litterae de cetero vulgarita conscribantur, quod partit ex eo, quod ante sua tempora nulle litterae vulgarita scripte reperiuntur, de negotiis vel contractibus quibus cumque. Here, Latin has become a dark, error-prone, and by tendency almost criminal idiom. For the 14th century, such statements, no matter how general in scope they seem to be formulated by Johann von Victring, were broadly limited to the domain of imperial administration. Such declarations of intent did not lead to Latin not being used as the administrative language in all regions and at all hierarchical levels. In other domains, especially in the vicinity of the Church, no one would have thought of putting forward such views at the time. The emergence of vernacular administrative prose goes hand in hand with the increase in the importance of cities, which has consequences not only socio-economically but also linguistically and culturally. In new time of secular intellectual, someone who has the functions of a lawyer, a clerk, and a writer begins to emerge in the municipal offices. Meister Hesse, who was attested as head of the city chancery in Strasbourg from 1230 to 1240, is the first city clerk known by name in the history of German. Furthermore, In the middle of the 13th century, Gottfried Hagen worked as a Cologne city clerk. In this capacity, he wrote, among other things, a comprehensive chronicle about Cologne. However, that does not formally belong to the contemporary literary avant-garde because it is written in traditional rhyming couplet form. German gradually makes its way into the language of charters, law, and business. However, the tradition is of such a variety and breadth that it is difficult to precisely survey, so must be wary of making generalizations. As such, the following overview neither aims for completeness nor does it claim to provide a chronology of the emergence of German administrative charters. Middle High German charter language only began to become established in the second third of the 13th century and thus on the threshold of late Middle High German. Nevertheless, there is at least one precursor worth mentioning, the so-called Cologne Schreinskarten. Schreinskarten are large format sheets of parchment that mainly contain records of real estate transaction and property. They could be described as the forerunners of today's land registers. Like all charters created in the German Empire up to the High Middle Ages, the language of the Cologne Schreinskarten is Latin. There is, however, one notable exception, namely Schreinkarte 3 of the Lawrence parish, where Middle High German, and more precisely Ripuarian, records of certifications are made that can be dated to between 1159 and 1172. The introductory formula notwithstanding, Middle High German dominates in the following entry. Haec carta vobis omnibus notificat qualita Adelheid uxo Lucemanni dat Huses hevet gemachet, dat Halfscheide, da sie innewohnet, is ihren zwein Sonnen Herimano et Mundo, of sieht ins Baren macht, dat ne gein irre an der Kinder nivet daranne, ne have, ne wäre die zwene Sude, die sie da gemachet havet. Whether the somewhat awkward style of the German passages is due to the lack of written variety in the vernacular or to its oral design requires further investigation. Beyond this individual case, however, we see the same sort of language in legal charters as we do in legal or factual prose. There is a coexistence of material originally composed in Latin and spoken in the vernacular. The respective linguistic structures interact in a variety of ways with the onset of writing in the vernacular. On the other hand, the oral beginnings of German charter language might also explain the conspicuously nimble and solid form with which, apart from certain forerunners like the Schreinskarten, appear from practically nowhere. This is particularly obvious in the area of charters in the narrower sense. Medieval charters, i.e. written testimonies of legal acts, follow a relatively rigid classification scheme which serves as a memory aid for oral communication. On a macro level, they consist of a protocol, context, and eschatology. The protocol usually includes the invocatio, in the name of, etc., the intitulatio, name and title of the issuer, the inscriptio, naming of the recipient, and the arranga, a general rhetoric justification. The context usually consists of a promulgatio, the declaration of intent to want to make law, the narratio, the list of the individual circumstances that prompted it, the dispositio, the law-making part, the sanctio, threat of punishment in the event of an infringement, and the corroboratio, statement of the means of authentication. The eschatology includes the subscriptiones, i.e. signatures of exhibitors and witnesses, as well as the date. As a rule, individual points tend to be left out in certain charters, but central elements of the charter form are always present, as can be seen, for example, in a charter issued by King Rudolf von Habsburg. In the protocol, the invocatio and arrenga are missing. The intitulatio names the issuer, via Rudolf von Gottes Gnaden, and the inscriptio refers to the recipient in a formulaic manner. Allen, die diesen Brief ansehend und hörend. In the context, the promulgatio is absent, while the narratio, dispositio und sanctio, Bundeswehr den Fried unter ihnen nicht wehren welle, der sie aus dem Frieden, are present. The eschatological, which I've omitted from the slide for space purposes, include the date as well as the signatures of witnesses and exhibitors. Further evidence for the assumption that German charter language went through an oral history before it found its way onto the parchment is that the relatively large degree of independence from Latin linguistic structures from the onset of their existence. This can be well demonstrated by a series of parallel Latin-German charters, the first of which is also one of the best-known medieval charters at all. That is the Mainzer Landfrieden, passed by Frederick II in 1235, which is considered the first German imperial law. Its immediate comprehensibility, even among the nobility, ensures that the law is observed on a broad basis. This charter had a great influence on the subsequent Landfrieden legislation, which was carried out in German, particularly in the south and west of the empire. The Latin charter begins with the noun testes, witnesses, which is determined by a generalizing relative clause. Before the predicate of the main clause, teniantur veritate testimonium peribere, two ablative absolutes are inserted. There is a relative clause which depends on the first of the absolutes. We will limit our comparison to two details of the German text. Right at the beginning, there is a free reformulation that is not caused by systematic linguistic constraints. Instead of formulating all witnesses whom the father names, like the Latin text does, the German text moves the Latin testes into the relative clause, all whom the father names as witnesses. The situation is somewhat different in the case of the ablative absolute, which has no equivalent in German. However, instead of imitating the Latin idiom with a construction of dative and participle, as often would be the case in Old or Early Middle High German, the German version of the Charter reproduces this through prepositional constructions. Non obstante consanguinate becomes nicht durch Magenschaft. A qualitative profiling of German charter language goes hand in hand with a quantitative profiling of the textual tradition. Temporally, we will now focus on the second half and more precisely the last fifth of the 13th century. Geographically, we'll focus on Upper Germany and parts of West Central Germany. Must be pointed out that in the 13th century, Latin remained the dominant charter language in the German Empire. There are roughly 4,500 vernacular witnesses compared to approximately 500,000 Latin ones. Only after 1350 do the proportion and importance of Latin charters decrease significantly in favor of the vernacular tradition. In contrast to the language of poets, it is generally easier to date and localize the text of charters, even if we have to compare information in the eschatological with paleographic data. Nevertheless, charters offer much greater value for classifying linguistic developments, both spatially and temporally. As an example, we return to the charter of Rudolf von Habsburg. In addition to the version that we had seen and which comes from Rudolf's chancery in Regensburg, Bavaria, a second copy of the charter has survived, which was drawn up half a year later in Rudolf's chancery in Mainz, Rhine-Franconia. First of all, we would like to briefly explain two important developments in the vocalism, which can be helpful to classify the linguistic geography of two copies of the charters. I will systematically go into the phonology of Middle High German in the next session. The New High German diphthongization of the Middle High German monophthongs I, U to I, Oi, Au first appeared in Styria and southeastern Bavaria as early as the 12th century, from which it then spread to central Bavaria in the 13th century. The monophthongization of the Middle High German diphthongs ie, uo, ue into New High German I, u, ü, on the other hand, remained limited to Central German textual witnesses until the 14th century. The map only shows the development of Middle High German uo. Let's first look at the state of the language in the Bavarian charter. Looking at the manuscript, the diphthongization of Middle High German I, Ü, U had already taken place. We have Freiheit instead of Freiheit, Leut instead of Lüte, and Gottshaus instead of Gotteshus. This is not surprising insofar as the new diphthongs spread in the 13th century from the South Bavarian origin in a northwesterly direction to the Danube and then in turn to Regensburg. The Middle High German diphthong ur is also consistently represented using a diacritic, namely v with a superscript o. There are numerous instances of syncope and apocope, both of which can also be considered characteristic of Bavarian Schreibsprachen of the 13th century. The consonants show a typically Bavarian feature, namely the verb and syllable initial letter P spelling of the label stop, here in Priev or Regensburg. Finally, a morphological characteristic of the Bavarian Schreibsprache is the retention of the old ending end in the third person plural present indicative. In many cases, the Rhenish-Franconian version of the Charter behaves similarly to the Regensburg version. The new High German diphthongization has not yet taken place, as evidenced by spellings such as Rieches or Hus, but the Central German monophthongization has compare the monographic vowel spellings in Brief, Krieg, Dun, and Bruder. Moving to the unstressed syllables, the Bavarian syncopes and apocopes are missing. Instead, there are a number of specifically Central German orthographic reflexes of the Medienverschiebung. Word initially, there is no shift of the voiced dental in Dun instead of Tuon, while in Krieche the voiced velar plosive appears in the to be orthographically represented with a fricative sign in medial syllables. The morphological archaisms characteristic of the Bavarian versions are not found in the Mainz version, like the shortened form of the possessive pronoun unseme instead of unsereme, typical of Rhenish-Franconian. As much as the language of the Charter differs from that of the literary tradition of the classical Middle High German period, one sociolinguistic similarity is unmistakable. In both cases, we are dealing with written language from the upper classes of society. Therefore, when speaking about features of orality in Charter language, one should always remember that this does not mean the everyday language of the majority population, but the language used by the elite. At the end of the 13th century, however, a type of source emerges that, in a certain respect, demonstrates some more widespread features of language, even if not always reliably. These sources are called urbaria, which are lists of the goods and taxes of the medieval manors. Their language is characterized by regional and, in some cases, very local features. They were used to identify properties and were often recorded on the basis of oral information from local farmers. To do this, Rödel, from Latin rotulus, a type of vertical roll, were used from which fair copies, the urbaria themselves, were created. Here you can see a Rödel in its characteristic form, which belongs to the Habsburg Urbarium collection. It is now kept in the main state archives in Stuttgart. A fair copy of the Urbarium was then transferred to conventional parchment codices, such as in the case of the so-called Meinhardisches Gesamturbar from 1288, the language of which we will take a closer look at. The spelling of the number 5 reflects the assimilation of n to m before the label fricative, and it thus closely reflects oral usage in orthography, much like in Hühner, which shows syncopation after a long root. The variance in the spelling of the number 4 is also striking. The relationship between Latin and the vernacular in the history of Urbaria closely resembles what we saw with charters. Before 1300, Latin, in black on the slide, dominates. The German translation, in red, is scarce at this time. As early as the first half of the 14th century, vernacular Urbaria begin to gain the upper hand, which we can tell from the regular and hitherto unexpected appearance in places that have no Latin Urbarium tradition. Next chapter, non-fiction verse versus prose. Again, we see a similar distribution between Latin and German in non-fiction texts as we did for legal prose texts. Vernacular non-fiction prose has been found in isolated cases since Old High German, take the Basel recipes for example. Such early approaches did not gain traction in the tradition due to the highly Latin-oriented context in which they were created and the prevalence of orality in the vernacular tradition up to the High Middle Ages. It is noteworthy, however, that we have a surviving theoretical justification for the prose form of non-fiction literature from the 12th century. We find this in the prologue, which was traditionally written in rhyming couplets, to the so-called Lucidarius, an encyclopedia originally written in Latin, the vernacular versions of which were transmitted through to the early modern period. As is the case for the early Middle High German Rolandslied, Henry the Lying is the patron of the German version, and he is, to a certain extent, the protagonist of the following passage. Sine Kapellane hieß, die Rede suchen an den Schriften, und bat, dass sie es tichten, ahne riemen wollten, wann sie in sollen nicht schrieben, wann die Wahrheit, als es zu Latine steht. In the 14th century, a Middle Low German encyclopedia was created based on the model of a preceding French and Middle Dutch version with the title of Buch Siedrach. Its similarity to the Lucidarius cannot be denied when looking at the prologue, even if the affinity of the prose form to truth is only paraphrased. Dit boek was in Walsche beschreven. Zonder riem in slechte woord. Toen werd ik daar toe bekort, dat ik dit boek woude maken, uten Walschen Dietsche spraken. Zonder rieme also ik zag, dat hij in den Walsche lag, omdat ik van die edlere leren een woord niet woude anders keren. Even between 1250 and 1350, the majority of non-fiction prose remained in Latin, but German material slowly began to appear. Scientific texts, think of Konrad von Megenberg, Deutsche Sphäre, Pharmacopoeias, travel literature and encyclopedias, namely Konrad von Megenberg's Buch von den natürlichen Dingen. The spectrum of sacred prose material is particularly broad. In the development of new religious practices in the second half of the 13th century, especially the emergence of mendicant orders such as the Franciscans and Dominicans, a significant corpus of German sermon literature emerged. Its most prominent author was the Franciscan Berthold von Regensburg, who was immensely popular during his lifetime and whom we have already mentioned in the context of the geographical extent of Middle High German. However, historical linguists should treat his vernacular sermons with caution, as they are German translation of Latin sermons and not transcripts of Middle High German sermon practice. If we single out the so-called monk of Heilsbronn, first half of the 14th century, from the vast area of devotional and treatise literature, we see again in the prologue that reflections are made about the suitability of the prose form as opposed to rhyme and couplet verse. Two things are of note here compared with the Lucidarius prologue. Firstly, the fact that the prologue itself appears again in rhyme and couplets. Secondly, that the prose form is once again referenced in connection with truth. The difference here, however, is that it is identified with the truth of salvation. By the way, that is not to say that verse and rhyme and couplets could not also help assure salvation. Auch han ich Mut in meinen Sinn, dass ich des klein Buchlin well ohne Reimen machen durch zweierhande Sachen. Die erst, dass ich diese Heiligkeit mit do nächtiger Wahrheit muge tester Bass bewahren, davon han ich Mut zu fahren der gemeinen Retistraßen und alles Reimen lasen. Die anderen Sache man davon nimmt, dass mir noch niemand anders zimmt zu reden von der Heiligkeit mit gereimter Klurheit. Wann das wahrlich pillig ist, so man singet oder list, von der frohen Heiligkeit, dass man das tue mit Andächtigkeit. This sort of justification in using prose form is clearly typical of treatise literature, as can also be seen from a type of instruction manual that precedes a confessional treatise written in the third quarter of the 14th century, i.e. shortly after the end of the late Middle High German period. The argumentation we saw in the example before is pointed out here in an ascetic style. Willst du aber getruwäcklichen biechten und woll, so merke diese kleine Lehre, die hier nachgeschrieben staat. Sie ist mit gebuwerischten Worten geschrieben, ahne Riemen und Gezierde, davon ist sie zu lesen verdrössentlichen und schwere und bringet sie doch der Seele Nutze. The prose form, according to the anonymous author, does not provide any reading pleasure and is therefore particularly good for conveying the notion of salvation. In addition, of course, it is noticeable that the prologue of the Bichtebuch is actually written in prose in contrast to the sources just discussed. However, it should be considered that texts dealing with confession and penance, like the Latin models, have tended almost without exception to be written in prose since the early High German period. Fourth chapter, Bible Epic, the Austrian Bible Translator. In the history of German, Martin Luther's September Testament of 1522 is still regarded as a turning point. Luther was, according to the standard theory, the first to make the text of the Holy Scriptures accessible to a lay audience without Latin proficiency. About 2 centuries before Luther, however, in the first half of the 14th century, an anonymous author prepared an annotated prose translation of a large parts of the Bible for a lay audience. The translation was widely received. 136 textual witnesses are currently known, 72 of them are commentaries on the Psalms, and 27 belong to the so-called Klosterneuburg Gospels. In view of such numbers, the relevance of this source for historical linguistic purposes should be quite clear. It is all the more astonishing that the scientific study of the Austrian Bible translator's oeuvre has just begun in recent years. A project is currently underway at the Bavarian Academy of Science to develop an edition, the results of which could provide the basis for a reassessment of the history of German Bible translation. We shall not go into detail here about the many reasons why these sources have been neglected for so long. Let us instead take a look at the text, specifically at the prologue of the Göttwerk manuscript of the Gospel work. After the anonymous narrator has asked God for help in communicating his commandments and Christian doctrine, he legitimizes his translation work as follows. An diesen Dingen geruch mich Herre Jesu Christe bestätigen und befesten und teil mit mir die Gnade deines Heiligen Geistes, dass ich die Arbeit, der ich, Herre, hier beginne, mit deiner Hilfe also vollbringen, dass du, Herre, allmächtiger Gott, gelobt und geehrt werdest, und in sündige Seele Gnad empfahre, und dass die ungelehrten Laien mit der Hoffnung deiner gottgleichen Lehr, als uns die heiligen Evangelisten von dir geschrieben haben, an christengleichem Glauben gefestigt und gebessert werden. Amen. Wie aber ich zu diesen Dingen leider unwürdig und nicht geweicht bin, noch geordnet Gottes Wort zu predigen und auch an Kunst ein Kind bin, doch trost ich mich deiner Barmherzigkeit, die als König David spricht, über alle deine Werk ist dein Barmherzigkeit. Und geruche mich Weisen und Lehren mit deines Heiligen Geistes Güte, die mir gnädiglich bei sei. Wann ich mich auch troste deiner göttlichen Wort, die du gesprochen hast, dass der Vater von Himmelreich seinen guten Geist gibt, denen, die ihn bitten, davon bitt ich dich, Herr, mit Andacht. Verleihe mir die Gnade von deines Heiligen Geistes Gute, als St. Pauls bat, dass ich von deinen göttlichen Werken anderen Leuten also schreib, dass ich selbst nicht schuldiger von deinem Gerichte funden werd. On the one hand, addressing an audience of uneducated laymen is remarkable. In doing so, the author explicitly places his recipients outside the Latin-speaking clerical sphere, which involves two decisions that, based on everything we have heard about late medieval written culture, no longer need to be mentioned separately: the choice of prose form and the choice of the vernacular. However, being situated outside of the Latin written culture also affects the narrator himself. He is clearly not a priest, but the formulation that he is an Kunst ein Kind is less clear. Literally, this only means that he is inexperienced in the techniques of conveying God's word. Nevertheless, he seems to have enjoyed a theological education, as can already be seen from the routine handling of the quotation from the Psalms and the words of Paul. If you look at the actual gospel work, it quickly becomes apparent that this offers much more than a translation, but contains extensive explanatory and commentary passages that a layman could never have written. Finally, the fact that a large number of other eschatological and heresiological treatises can be attributed to the anonymous individual in question speaks in favor of the assumption that we are dealing with an extremely accomplished theologian. As mentioned, the scholarly debate around the work of the Austrian Bible translator is still in its infancy. Nevertheless, I would like to discuss an example to briefly illustrate the far-reaching consequences that this reappraisal could have for the history of the language. One of the truths of German lexical history that has not remained unchallenged for a long time is that Middle High German Arbeit has predominantly negative connotations like effort, suffering, agony, which is usually associated with a Christian idea of the Vale of Tears and or with the contempt for physical work in feudal society. The improvement in the meaning of Arbeit in the sense of gainful work is dated to early New High German and, with recourse to Max Weber's thesis of the birth of capitalism from Protestant ethics, is associated with the emergence of the Calvinist doctrine of predestination. But in the first half of the 14th century, i.e. 2 centuries before Luther and Calvin, the Austrian Bible translator describes his activity as Arbeit, and there is nothing to suggest that he associated it with negative connotations. Otherwise, he probably wouldn't have requested the support of Christ for its accomplishment. And a final chapter on language contact, the archives of the Lords of Boulay. The small town of Boulay in Lorraine was originally owned by the Lords of Fenetrange. In the 12th century, it was the seat of a lordship that was successfully expanded in the 13th and 14th centuries to include a number of presumably German-speaking towns. Nevertheless, there are feudal connections to the Francophone counts of Luxembourg from the beginning of the 12th century. Because of this, the archives of the Lords of Boulay are still very suited for investigating historical language context on a small scale. The broad lines seem to map the area they initially controlled, even though Boulay is a few kilometers east of the linguistic border that you can see on the slide. The charter tradition was dominated by Old French until the end of the 14th century. The choice of language can be analyzed according to 3 factors: time, space, and communication partner, issuer or recipient. The result of a longitudinal study shows that Latin here, like everywhere else, is being replaced successfully by the vernacular, with German only appearing a generation after the relative consolidation of French. The choice between Latin and the vernacular persists throughout the entire period, regardless of whether the Lords of Boulay were the issuer or recipient of charters. The important factor is whether the intended communication partner works in an ecclesiastical institution, such as the Trier or Mainz Curia. In such a case, the document is usually in Latin, otherwise it is in French or German. As far as the relationship between vernacular languages is concerned, the late appearance of German documents in the correspondence of the Lords of Boulay, for the issuer it's 1333, for the recipient 1329, is astonishing because the town, as we have seen, is clearly east of the language border. It is noteworthy, on the one hand, that recipient documents are still written in French even if the issuers, such as the Lords of Fénétrange and the Counts de la Petite Pierre, had long since switched to German for producing charters. Boulay was clearly francophone on the Schreibsprache level. Given this relatively complex starting point, it is not surprising that Boulay's archive accounts for two-way language contact. Germanic interferences in French documents usually do not affect the orthography, rather they affect lexicon. They are also characterized by explanatory comments. Nous, Henri Sieur de Vinetranche, et nous, Gérard de Warnesbech, le Vieux, et nous, Garcile de Frestov Chevalier, et je, Jean, Candy, Nimmene Front, nobody's friend, Escuyer. Or, le près que c'est et est assis et est qu'on appelait der Brühl. The meadow that is an A and is called the Brühl, a kind of hill. Nicolas le Vieux, justicier d'Arlan Dietrich de Sept-Fontaine-Thiles, le Scholtes de Boulay, Kenkel de Care, and finally, while the German elements in the first example might be explained by the general tendency not to adapt proper names in the target language, the two following cases are technical terms. The specific term Brühl makes it easier to identify the area in question. Scholtes designates a specific function within the feudal system, a kind of mayor, although the same person can also be found in French in other sources. That's the last example on the slide. Thiles jadis prévôt, which is the French term, de Boulay. The spelling Scholtes with X is a characteristic example of orthographic border traffic as a German term with East French spelling of the initial sound, X denotes a sibilant, occurs here in a French document. The German charters from Boulay show a number of interferences which, unlike the French sources, are largely limited to correspondences in the graphemic and phonemic systems. 4 cases in particular catch the eye. The already mentioned use of X for the sibilant, GU for a voiced velar stop before the front vowels E, OU for U, and hypercorrected H in initial position. The last 3 phenomena mentioned are general Franco-German contact phenomena that cannot be localized more precisely, while the use of X for a sibilant is tested mainly for Eastern French, especially in Lorraine Schreibsprachen from the first half of the 14th century, mostly in the spelling of place names of Germanic origin. We are dealing here with a relatively small-scale contact phenomenon. One or more of the interferences mentioned occur in 15 out of 31 corpus texts from the Boulay archives. However, the quality of the occurrence appears to be more interesting than the quantity. In the vast majority of instances, the Romance interferences only show up in certain contexts, for example with selected proper names or hypercorrected H. The systematic occurrence of Romance orthographic interferences is particularly noteworthy in Bibliothèque Nationale de France, Collection Lorraine 591, number 31, from November 1329. The interferences are marked in color. We don't have to go into detail to see their importance. With this excursion to the spatial and temporal boundaries of Middle High German, we have now concluded the first half of the lecture series, which has been oriented towards sociolinguistics, language culture, and textual tradition. In the remaining 4 sessions, I will complement this perspective with a closer look on grammar, trying to deepen and systematize some of the aspects that we have touched on. Thank you very much.